Let's talk about our SEC, our final power rankings for 2024 for the Southeastern Conference. And you and I have talked about this off air a lot, and we have kind of different approaches to our final power rankings. So I think we should get into it.
Okay, let's start where we probably agree, and then we'll move on to where we may disagree. So I'm going to do my bottom five and see if you have any disagreement with it.
Okay.
So last place, Mississippi State. I just think that's a massive turnaround. You know, they're just not very good. Like, I'd take every team in the SEC over them. I think every team in the SEC had a better
on that one. That is on my list. We agree.
Kentucky's next. I think they're just pathetic. They're pitiful. Sorry to any Kentucky fans that may catch this. They're not very good. Auburn next. And then I had Oklahoma and Arkansas. So those are my bottom five.
Those are my bottom five as well. So look at that in that order, which I'm actually kind of floored that they're in that order because,
and I wouldn't fight anybody if they wanted to go other places. Like Oklahoma made a bowl game and beat Auburn head to head. Kentucky, Mississippi State, Arkansas, finished a little better than people thought. So I had them higher. I've got Vandy next.
Okay. I have A&M next.
Okay. I thought that A&M was a little more impressive than Vandy. I know that Vandy finished with a bowl win. I don't know how much I factored bowl season into mine because I just don't. It's hard to put a lot of weight on a game that other guys opt out of, other teams don't care about. Like how much does the one bowl win matter? I thought A&M was slightly more impressive than Vandy. I'm not going to fight about that one too hard. Did you have Vandy next, or how did you?
I actually had
your next two?
Next.
There's our first big disagreement.
This is our first big disagreement. I understand that Missouri finished with a decent record. I also think Missouri could have walked through their schedule and been 10-2, which I've said since July, right? Like I felt like it was going to be hard for them to finish worse than 10-2 with the way that their schedule shook out. I have Missouri. I think that I don't know. I felt like Vandy was more impressive than Missouri. I think that, and part of that is probably what they've done, but they started with less. And I think that they ended up being more impressive. I do take bowl wins into some account here. I understand that people opt out, but I think being able to continue to keep your team motivated for something that maybe doesn't really matter is kind of important, right? And I take that into consideration. Where do you have Missouri?
I have them way higher than that.
Higher.
Yeah. Okay. My thing so I have them, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7th. So pretty, significantly higher. They went 10-3. They beat Vandy head to head. And so I certainly would have them ahead of Vandy. Their losses were to
head-to-head matters.
I think head-to-head matters in some context. I don't think it's the end-all be-all because I don't have Vandy ahead of Alabama. But I do think it is a data point that matters. It's not, you could never say, it couldn't be the end-all be-all because all these teams beat up on each other. So, but it is one data point that matters. They beat Vandy. Their losses were respectable. They didn't have any really great wins, but they lost to South Carolina. They lost to Bama. And they lost to A&M. So no, just awful losses. And they finished with 10 wins, winning their last 3 games, including a bowl win where they were, a dog, right? So, and playing with a backup. So I had Missouri quite a bit higher. I had Vandy, A&M, LSU were my next 3.
So I went Missouri, Vandy. I did Alabama, LSU. So just those two flip-flopped. And I think
Alabama behind LSU?
I had Alabama 1 behind LSU. And I think part of that is that I just picture the end of the season as such a collapse for Alabama. And I was looking at it less about the totality of the season and more about the type of football that I felt like they were playing towards the end. And I just, you look at that Oklahoma loss, and then they lose to a Michigan team that had far more opt-outs than they did. I don't know. It felt like they weren't playing great football at the end there. It felt like it was kind of becoming a mess. I'm interested to see what happens this offseason and how they pull it together. And part of it is the expectations that we always have for Alabama, right? And maybe that's not fair. Like DeBoer should have some time to establish his own thing there. But that's not the Alabama we're used to seeing. And they were in a position where they could have made the playoffs had they just taken care of business against a pretty crappy Oklahoma team. And not only did they not win, but they looked awful. And
Yeah.
I feel like they carried that into the bowl game. And I think they looked worse at the end of the season than I think LSU looked.
Yeah, I had him ahead. Yeah, I had him ahead of LSU for sure. I I mean, yeah, Bama was a little higher for me. I kind of made it by tiers because I did look more season totality. Like beating Georgia mattered to me. Blowing out LSU on the road mattered to me. And they didn't finish incredibly well, but I had them so much higher before their kind of disastrous end that I didn't drop them down to like awful. But I mean, I had Bama 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, kind of in a tie with Missouri. So kind of the same thing. Like Bama
I'm
schedule.
looking at it like if we were to set a playoff with these teams, how far do I think they would each get? And that's and
So
taking
I think
into
you projected a little bit more. I kind of did more of a here's what their season was, which we talked about this.
I,
I did kind of here's what their season really was, like looking at the year in totality.
TJ and I have kind of different viewpoint on power rankings in general. I was looking at how I think they are in the week that we are making these power rankings, taking recency into account. TJ is looking at it more totality, how they did the entire season. It's just kind of two different approaches to how we look at this. What I'm doing in my power rankings wouldn't necessarily be what I would say the polls should say, it taking into account the entire season, if that matters. But I mean, we basically had LSU and Alabama flip-flopped.
I had Bama a little bit higher, like
Oh,
3 spots.
okay. I don't know why I thought you had. Okay.
So go to your top. Let's go to the top.
Okay.
I
So
had I
go
had
ahead.
Texas. I mean, I had the three playoff teams.
I did too.
I had Texas, UGA, Tennessee in that order.
That's what I had in that order as well. I
Okay.
think obviously Texas got the furthest, right? But that's who I had in that order.
Yeah.
And I think we're going to have some disagreement on these next few
Yeah.
right
I
here.
struggled with I will say I struggled putting Texas ahead of Georgia. But I do think the way that it finished mattered. I thought Georgia did a good job to get to the playoff, win the SEC. I think the SEC championship game mattered. I thought they looked kind of just okay against a 7-5 Georgia Tech team, a 7-6 Georgia Tech team that ended up losing their bowl. Obviously, going to 8 overtimes. They had just lost to Ole Miss before that. They had struggled with Florida. So I don't know. Season in totality, I had Texas a little bit higher.
I could flip flop either one of them.
I wasn't. Yeah,
for
that was a
that.
tough one. How much I waited? I
Those two,
waited recency.
yeah, before you
somewhat.
put Tennessee.
I mean, I had Ole Miss next. I had Ole Miss at number 4. They finished 10-3. They had the really bad loss to Florida, obviously, but they finished the year well and blew out their bowl opponent. And I think winning a few games down the stretch, finishing 10-3. The way they looked, what was crazy about them is they were the number 1 team in scoring offense and scoring defense, and still found a way to lose 3 games over the course of the season. But I had Ole Miss 4th. Like Ole Miss to me would be favored against anybody else they played below them in my rankings, and so I had Ole Miss.
So
4th.
I don't think Ole Miss would be favored against Florida if they played the week after they lost to Florida, which is how I'm
I
looking.
think they'd be favored right now.
See, and I had Florida 4th. I think when you finish
My goodness.
when you finish the season, keeping LSU out of the playoffs, keeping Ole Miss out of the playoffs, winning your bowl game, I like Florida head to head against Ole Miss. They beat them the second to last week of the season. So, I find it hard, and not just beat them, soundly beat them. I think
by a touchdown.
that game was never in question. There was
No,
never
I'm just saying it wasn't like
that game.
soundly beat. Florida at 4 is way too high to me. I don't think they're favored against Ole Miss. I don't think they're favored against South Carolina. I had ahead of them. I think Florida at 4 is
I
insane.
had Florida, Ole Miss, South Carolina. That was my next
Yeah,
three.
I think you're
I
you're
think
you're you're
it's
orange and blue.
those teams. Like I don't. You just said earlier that head to head has to matter.
It matters as one data point. It's not the end all be all.
If they had played the first 3 weeks of the season, I can understand that argument. But they played the second to last week of the season, and
But
Florida
to me, that doesn't
wasn't
so
a
again, the way
second Hail Mary.
I mean, I'm just telling you 100% right now, and you can disagree with this.
I do.
On a neutral site, Ole Miss would be favored against Florida right now. There's no question at all. Like that's not like you think they would win, I think they would win. Like in Vegas, Ole Miss would be favored against Florida on a neutral site right now. There's no doubt about it.
I disagree.
I mean that it's not an disagreement thing. Like they absolutely would be ranked ahead or like favored against. I also think that head to head matters, but Kentucky's not ahead of Ole Miss in yours. Like Vandy's not ahead of Bama in
They didn't
yours.
play the second to last week of the season.
Yeah,
And
teams get bad games, and to me, they would still be South Carolina. I thought South Carolina. I almost put South Carolina ahead of Ole Miss. If they'd have won their bowl game, I'd have put them ahead. South Carolina finished winning. You talk about recency. South Carolina won 6 games in a row down the stretch. Florida didn't do that. They beat 3 ranked teams
they also
in
did
that stretch.
Texas and Georgia in their last 6 games.
South Carolina won 6 in a row, 4 of those being against ranked teams. So there's no way that I'm putting Florida ahead of South Carolina either. Like South Carolina, to me, I almost put if South Carolina wins their bowl game.
Last 3.
Say what?
Florida. 2 of Florida's last 3 games were top 10 opponents that they beat and kept out of the playoffs.
Okay, South Carolina, 4 of their last 6 were ranked and 2 were top 12. So like I'm not,
But not
and one of them was a playoff team. So I would have South Carolina. South Carolina would absolutely be favored over Florida right now too on a neutral site.
I mean, you can say that, but I don't think you can say with 100% certainty. Is there a way to check that? Because if there is, let's do it.
I mean, if Vegas does hypothetical odds, I don't think they're going to do hypothetical odds for us this year. We could ask Craig if he could have one of his lines makers. We'll ask Craig.
That's what we'll do.
Yeah, we'll ask Craig to do Ole Miss and Florida on a neutral site, and then South Carolina and Florida on a neutral site. So my final ones were Texas, Georgia. See, we're so used to putting Bama up there. Right. Texas, Georgia, Tennessee, Ole Miss, South Carolina. Then I had the Bama Missouri duo. Then I had Florida, LSU, and then the rest of them. Okay. So I had Florida at like 8th, 7th, 8th, somewhere in there.
I think that's. I mean, so I'm Texas, Georgia, Tennessee, Florida, Ole Miss, South Carolina, LSU, Alabama, Vandy, Missouri, A&M, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Auburn, Kentucky, Mississippi State.
Yeah, I just think that I also so am I a hater for saying this? Probably, but I wasn't incredibly impressed with now I know they won and they won both games decisively. I wasn't incredibly impressed with the way that Florida looked for large portions of their last 2 games against Florida State and Tulane. I think even Florida fans were pretty annoyed at how close the game was at halftime. Now they ended up salting it away and Tulane was down a quarterback, and I get that. Even Florida fans were like,
Florida was down some D linemen as well.
I mean, it's still Tulane though. So I don't know. I think that Florida wasn't incredibly impressive against Tulane. They did put it on kind of late, and kind of like what you see in college basketball when you go up against a mid-major, the better team ends up winning big. But I wasn't incredibly impressed with the way they played against a really bad Florida State team either. Now they scored late again to win by 20, but that game was really closer for most of that game than it really should have been.
Told me that it doesn't matter in terms of some of these teams that lost their bowl game. So like it's a knock against Florida for winning their bowl game, but you weren't super impressed with it. But it's not a knock against some of these other teams on their list who didn't win the bowl game. And look, I do think every bowl. I mean, are you telling me you were impressed with the way they played? No, I was not impressed. But I think a win.
Yeah, I think it's just another data point. So, yeah, no, for sure. But I also think who you're playing matters. I think when you play a Tulane team that's pretty down, when you play a Florida State team that's absolutely god awful, and you're not kind of just walking up and down the field with them, it's just another data point to consider. if they'd have beaten Florida State by 40 and never really looked back and did, that would have been one thing. But if they'd have done the same thing to Tulane and jumped out to a 21-0 lead or whatever and just blown them out, then I probably would have looked at it differently. But I didn't think either. I mean, even Florida fans were complaining that I follow.
I don't think anybody loved the way that they looked. They would like even more dominant performances, but I do think a win's a win. But
Yeah. And they get credit for it, but I took a little bit away from that. So, all right. Well, I'm glad that we got to the end of that and we agree that I'm right.